Hello everybody and welcome back. I am super excited for today's video. This is the first of this kind that I've done on the channel, I think, and it is a series review slash recommendation slash why you should read for Sebastien de Castell's Greatcoats series. This is a series that I read last week. I had, if anybody watched my June TBR, I had book 2, which is called Night Shadow, on my TBR for June. And I read book 2 and could not stop. So then I read books 3 and 4 right afterwards and finished the entire series. And because I loved this series so much, and also because I feel like I was a little bit misled by the general consensus on the internet, or the things that I had heard about this series, I feel like didn't give me an accurate depiction of what the entire series was actually like. So I hope that with this video, I might convince some people who have put this on their TBR but haven't really quite gotten into it yet, or maybe some people who read book 1 and had some mixed feelings about it, that the rest of the series is 100% worth continuing on with. I am going to give you a little rundown of the series itself. This will be completely spoiler free, so this is for people who haven't started or haven't yet finished the series. I will be spoiler free for all 4 books, but I'm going to give you just a little description of what they're about and then touch on the various aspects and how those aspects of the series make this such a good read. We will start off with just like I said, kind of a rundown of the series at large. So Sebastien de Castell's Greatcoats series is a 4-book series. The books are called Traitor's Blade, Night Shadow, Saint's Blood, and Tyrant's Throne. There is a new book in this same world that is coming out, I believe, in September, but it is not part of this main series, but does give the people who really love the Greatcoats something to look forward to. So if you are a big fan of de Castell's writing, then there is a new series on the horizon that you can enjoy. In our first book of Traitor's Blade, we are introduced to the 3 main characters of the series, and their names are Falcio, Brasti, and Kest. And the landscape that we're given is the country of Tristia, and Tristia is a country in chaos. 5 years before the beginning of the series, the monarch, King Palus, was brutally murdered in an uprising by the various dukes and duchesses that run the different sections of the country. So this is the country is supposed to be fashioned into a monarchy with a king or queen at its head, and then these various dukes and duchesses who run their respective duchies. The dukes and duchesses staged this revolution, this coup. They marched on the king's castle, and for reasons unknown at the beginning of the novel, the king's loyal magistrates, so these are his greatcoats, the individuals that he has hand-selected or had hand-selected to serve alongside him as a group of people who did not bow to the crown, who were entrusted with the great responsibility of carrying out justice in the country. They stood aside while these dukes and duchesses marched in and murdered King Palus. So we open up into a country that is without a monarch and has been so for 5 years. A country that is completely embroiled in these petty divisions and petty arguments between the various duchies. And we follow Falcio, Brasti, and Kest as they are trying to figure out how they fit into this new world. Their entire identities were kind of taken up by the idea of being greatcoats. This was very much who they were. King Palus had gathered a group of people who were very passionate about the law, passionate about justice, and very loyal to one another. And so we see how this group has been fractured and how they're left kind of aimless out in the countryside, reviled by the nobility for their role in enforcing the king's justice, and reviled by the peasantry for being what they look on as people who have betrayed their king. So people without honor who stood aside while their king was brutally murdered. And instead of being known as the Greatcoats, they are now known as the Tratari or Tattercloaks. So these people who were once very proud, not even really warriors, but enforcers of the law, who have now been kind of brought low by the circumstances of their country. We know that when King Palis was alive, there was a larger group of Greatcoats, but upon his demise, he entrusted all of them with individual quests that he wanted them to go out and try to accomplish once he was gone. And the only Greatcoats that we know of as this novel opens up are our three main characters who have been traveling together in this period since the fall of the monarchy. So that's kind of the background that we're given, and that comes about right at the beginning of the story. There is a little bit of info dumping. It's kind of a bit of a bumpy start. You can definitely tell that this is de Castell's first novel, but we get a lot of that information right from the beginning. And what happens in book one is that we follow these three characters, but mainly the character of Falcio, who was known as the first cantor of the Greatcoats. The Greatcoats, kind of one of their little quirks is that in order to enforce the king's justice, whenever they would preside over a trial, they would sing the verdict so that the common folk would be able to remember it and pass it on. So instead of just getting up and kind of soliloquizing in front of a group of people who may or may not have understood what they were saying, their setup would be that they would sing the king's justice. So they would sing the laws of the kingdom and they would sing the verdicts that they would deliver. So the leader of all the Greatcoats was known as the first cantor, and that is Falcio. And so we follow Falcio and his friends as they're traveling through Tristia, trying to, number one, fulfill their final duties to their king, and number two, still feel like they can enforce the laws of justice wherever possible. Obviously, they are very powerless in this new society, but they do try their best to still stand up for what they believe in. The central mystery of this story mostly focuses on Falcio's quest. So the king has asked Falcio to search out a specific item for him, and Falcio has no idea what this item is, where it might be, or why it is important. But as the book moves forward, we get to follow Falcio in particular as he finds himself embroiled in I want to call it like the violence of the dukes, and he gets entangled in their machinations. And as this book progresses, we get to see some of the big players on the political scene of Tristia. We get to see some of the most reviled dukes, some of the most horrendous people that you will ever meet. And we get to see how they interact with the Greatcoats and how they're kind of sending their little webs out across the country, and how Falcio is going to try to intervene with that. So that's the setup of the first novel. We get secondary characters that trickle in who become of great importance. We get characters that we really love at the beginning of the book that we will hate by the end, and characters that we kind of hate at the beginning of the book that we will come to enjoy, appreciate, and maybe even love by the end of the series. So this is most definitely a book of setup. We're getting introduced to the basics of the world building, the past history of the Greatcoats, and we're getting to know our characters a little bit. As I said, this first one is a little bumpy, and there are some very strange character interactions and a couple of really convenient plot points. So there's a couple of plot conveniences that happen here. But I will say that if you read book one and you stop the series, I feel that you are doing yourself a great disservice. If you like the overall tone of the novel, if you enjoy the characters, if you find the story to be engaging, but you just have a couple of those niggling issues where you're like, God, like I just don't understand why de Castell did that, or oh, like of course that's how it ended, or this is the resolution that it came to, I really think you should read on, because books 2, 3, and 4 not only expand on and explain some of the questions that you might have in book one, but I think the series just gets better and better as it goes on. As de Castell found his voice, as he improved upon his craft, as he got to show us more about these characters and what really makes them tick, what really drives them forward. I think that the books just get better and better as you go on. And if you compare in terms of just pure quality, book 1 to book 4, I don't even feel like they're in the same level. Like they are on completely different levels in terms of writing. So if you kind of enjoyed book 1, then I would say charge forward with the rest of the series, 100%. Because this is a 4-book series, I am someone who loves to binge read series. So I read all of these books last week, really loved them. But for people who like to space out their reads, like if you want to read 1 book a month or you want to read 1 book every couple of months, this is a fantastic series to do that with, because each book has its own self-contained arc. Each book has a central mystery. Each book really focuses on one of the Greatcoats. So we get kind of an introduction to the group in book 1. We really get to know Sebastien in book 2. We get to learn a lot about Castell in book 3. And then we get Falkio's grand conclusion in book 4. And from chatting with Alan at the Library of Alexandria, he really loves this series and has talked to a lot of people about it. And it seems to be that whichever character you enjoy the most, that kind of dictates which book you're going to enjoy the most. So the people who love Sebastien tend to love book 2. If you love Castell, then you will probably love book 3. And if you are a die-hard fan of Falkio, as I most definitely am, then I cannot see how you would not adore book 4. It is such a good conclusion to this series. But as I was saying, each book is pretty self-contained. Neither of them ends on a cliffhanger. They've got a nice little wrap up at the end. So it definitely is a series where you could start, give yourself a break for a couple of months and continue on if that's the way that you like to read things, so that you don't feel burnt out or feel like you're getting too much of the same character. And speaking of characters, I feel like if we're going to go into why you should read this book, then the characters are definitely a huge part of that. As I was reading this, I could not believe, and I said this to Alan as I was chatting to him about the series, it boggles my mind that I hear about these fantastic fantasy friendships. Like I hear about Locke and Jean from the Lives of Locke Lamora, and I hear about Royce and Hadrian from the Rhaeria Revelations. And you hear about Frodo and Sam, and there are some kind of quintessential friends in fantasy that you hear about, but I don't hear anybody talk about the Greatcoats, which is a shame, because this is hands down, having read most of those other series, having read some fantastic friendships in my time, this is the best literary friendship that I have ever read. No holds barred. Like it is the pinnacle of literary friendship for me. And that for me means the friendship between the 3 Greatcoats that we follow, so Falkio, Sebastien, Castell, but also the relationship that we get to see through the use of flashbacks between Falkio and King Palis. And this relationship between Falkio and Palis is one of the pillars of the series, something that connects all 4 of the books together, something that impacts the way that Falkio thinks, the decisions that he makes, his purpose, his driving force. So much of that comes from the relationship that he had established with King Palis. And it is heartbreaking. In book 1, as you get to know more about the way that they interacted with one another, what they meant to each other, as you learn through flashbacks what really happened to the kingdom and what happened between Falkio and Palis as Palis realized that his end was coming. It is absolutely heartbreaking, and also the highlight of the first book, in my opinion. The action is great, the banter is great, but it's that relationship that you see between Falkio and Palis that made it rise above for me. And that is something that, even though those flashbacks become much fewer and farther between the longer you go on in the series, you can see the influence of that relationship and how it impacts Falkio's psychology, how it impacts his decision making as we continue in the series. As for Falkio and his 2 companions, I have never seen a group of friends who respect each other, who would die for each other, who understand each other in quite the same way as these characters. We have, so just to kind of tell you what they're like. We have Falchio, who is the first cantor or the leader of the Greatcoats. He is exactly what you would expect from the leader of a group of people who were brought together on the principles of justice. Falchio is very black and white in his thinking. He knows that there is a right and there is a wrong, and he wants to fight for what is right. He believes in the law, but even more than that, he believes in justice. And that is a conversation that happens throughout the course of these novels. What happens when justice and the law are at odds with one another? And this causes a lot of cognitive dissonance for Falchio, a lot of questioning of his own morality, of his own decisions, and that is a fascinating element of the story. But we have Falchio, who is this idealistic, fiery, determined man who is driven by this sense of purpose and this belief in justice and the belief that the world can be a place where fairness is prized and people have equal opportunities in life, which is a really difficult sort of person to be in the country that he lives in. Then we have Sebastien, who is our comedic relief, but a fully fleshed out and realized character. He is a past poacher. So before joining the Greatcoats, he was a poacher. And so he kind of hovers on that morality. He is not quite as impassioned by that as Falchio, but has a strong connection to the common man. He has a lot of love for the peasantry. He has a lot of hatred for the nobility and for the knights that work for them and just kind of carry out the actions of their masters without caring who they hurt or what kind of laws they're enforcing. He is the heart of this group. He knows Falchio and Castell, who are much more driven and much more serious. He knows how to bring them out of their slumps. He knows how to make them feel better about themselves and feel good about what they are doing. And he's hilarious. He is, I find it hard. Humor can be very hit or miss for me in fantasy, but Sebastien's so funny. He's so good. His one-liners are excellent. The way that he can antagonize his friends, but you can tell that he's doing it either out of love or from trying to distract them from like what utter shit they've gotten themselves into. Like he is comic relief used in the best possible way. And then the third main character is Castell. And Castell is your very stoic, driven, talented swordsman. He is a prodigy, essentially. He is the best swordsman in the country of Tristia, perhaps in the world, and he has this kind of single-minded devotion to Falchio. And their particular friendship, even outside their group of three, is explored a lot in these books, and we get to know a lot about what drives Castell, what brought him into the Greatcoats, why he decided to pursue this life. He, like I said, is very dry. When he does make a joke, it is so impactful because he is usually very stoic. And their three personalities just mesh together so well. And what I like, because I feel like a lot of the time in fantasy, I am told that groups of people are great friends. These people understand each other so well, and sometimes the author will even write like they would die for each other. I would do this for you. But with these Greatcoats, see, I'm barely coherent because I love this so much. With these three characters, the way that they interact, and this is from the very first pages, the level of comfort they have with each other, how well they know what each individual is going to do and how that will affect him, it just shows such a depth of emotion and such a fantastic friendship. If for no other reason, I think you should read these books all the way through to see the most beautiful depiction of friendship that I have ever seen in fantasy. Hands down, 100%, end of discussion. You can disagree with me in the comments, but you will not sway me from this thought. So now that we've touched a little bit on kind of the setup and the characters, I want to talk a little bit about those other elements. So like the world building, the themes, the writing, and they all kind of blend together, the tone. So the world building here kind of builds as the novels progress. I think one of the main complaints in the first novel was that it was very light on world building. You don't find out a lot about Tristia. You don't find out a lot about history. You don't find out a lot about the Greatcoats. And I will say that if you had those issues in book 1, I wholeheartedly believe that that was intentional on Sebastien de Castell's part. We enter into Tristia, which is a country fractured. It is a country at war with itself, where people live to double cross each other, where there has been a failure to remember its history, a failure to uphold its ancient and sacred laws. And I really think that this is intentional. We find out bits and pieces of the history as Falkio finds out bits and pieces of the history. There are elements of the Greatcoats themselves that Falkio does not discover until we get to book 3 or book 4 in the series. Just as this country is fractured, so we are given a fractured understanding of how people exist, of what's important, of like I said, of the religion, the history. And as that kind of starts to piece together for us, it also starts to piece together for the characters. And some of those really important underlying themes, like the theme of how history influences or impacts the present. What happens when justice and the law are at odds? What happens when the things that you are fighting for, the ways in which you've tried to do that, what happens when they actually cause more problems for people than solving problems? These are all things that Falkio, Castell, and Sebastien have to grapple with. They have to come to terms with some very disappointing failures over the course of this book. And that was something that I was not prepared for. Every time you hear about the Greatcoats, you hear it described as like swashbuckling fun, a great adventure fantasy. And it is that. I love adventure fantasy. This is very much influenced by the Three Musketeers. You get that sense of camaraderie, you get that sense of adventure, you get some of those really high octane moments where you're kind of traveling from one place to another, you're embarking on a quest. But you also get some really dark moments. So you get some darkness in kind of the typical way in terms of like torture, of characters being significantly hurt emotionally, psychologically, physically. You get character deaths, which will kind of rip your heart out. But you also get these really intense examinations of really difficult topics. You get Falkio, whose entire purpose in life is to see justice done, and you get to see him watch as the actions that he carries out against some really evil people, how those actions actually end up hurting the very citizenry that he is trying to protect. And you have to see him grapple with that. You have to see him come to terms with the fact that some of the things that he believed in might not be true. The way that he saw certain people in his life, those that may have been colored by his own idealism. And it's really fascinating to watch. Seeing Falkio hit kind of the lowest of lows along with these really high exciting moments in this series is so fascinating, and it makes for such a rich, rewarding reading experience. If you pick this up and you read book 1 and you think that it's just like another adventure fantasy with, an okay plot and a resolution that you weren't super happy with, you could not be doing yourself a greater disservice by stopping the series. I would encourage everyone to continue. These become imbued with so much depth. They explore things that I feel don't get explored often in that subgenre of fantasy. And they kind of meld elements that people tend to really love from grimdark fantasy with that sense of adventure. And I think that the resulting narrative is so, so good. I loved this series. Loved it. For right now, I just want to kind of add my voice to the group of booktubers like Alan over at the Library of Alexandria, whose enthusiasm is what made me pick up this series. So I am very, very grateful for that. But I would just like to lend my voice and encourage people to pick up this series. I think that Tyrant's Throne, the final book, is probably the best conclusion that I have ever read to a fantasy series. It is my favorite concluding volume of a series. Like I said, the amount of growth in terms of the characters from book 1 to book 4, the increase in quality of the novels from book 1 or book 4 is astounding. And I just really want other people to read this. It is heartbreaking. It is fun. When I read the final book, I cried 8 times. My 7-year-old asked me if there were any tears left in my tear sacks when I was done, because I had cried so much. And not about death. Like, I feel like whenever we say that we cry, people assume that it was a character death. And there may have been a character death or two that really, really upset me and really kind of wrung those emotions from me. But for the most part, these were character moments, moments of quiet despair, moments of realization in terms of the characters, moments of change that can't be stopped. And also some moments of love and kinship that you know are about to come to an end, or you worry are about to come to an end. And it's so heartbreaking. Sebastien de Castell writes with such emotion without, in my opinion, things ever feeling trite or manipulative. This is, you know, some of the most heart-wrenching work in fantasy that I have ever read, and I loved every moment of reading it. After all that, if you have been on the fence, if you have wanted to read this series, please go pick it up. If you have read it, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you've read it and it's not for you, then you can also feel free to let me know why, and I will once again try my best to convince you in the comments section. But that is all. I hope that this was coherent-ish or coherent adjacent, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!